Is this thing on?
Hi.
Hello?
Is this thing on?
Hi, is this thing on?
Is this thing on?
Is this thing on?
Hi, is this thing on?
Are we open?
Welcome to Open Ed Mike, a podcast where voices from across the educational landscape share insights, stories, and strategies for transforming learning through openness. Whether you're new to open education or a seasoned practitioner, Open Ed Mike invites you into the conversation. My name is Zach Claybaugh. I am at Dominican University in River Forest, Illinois. And let's hear from our other host joining us today. Brittany?
Hi, everyone. I'm Brittany Dudek, and I am coming from the Colorado Community College system.
And I am Kevin Corcoran, coming from the University of Central Florida in not-so-sunny Orlando today.
And one of our usual hosts, Mike Mills, is not able to join us today, so it's just the three of us, joined by our guest, Jonathan Lashley. Jonathan is an experienced educator, strategist, and national voice in the open education community. He currently serves as the Academic Technology Program Manager for the Idaho Board of Education. With a background that spans instructional design, faculty development, and systems-level leadership, Jonathan has worked with colleges and universities across the country to expand access to learning through thoughtful use of open resources and practices. He brings a unique perspective on how open education can serve a wide range of institutional missions and student needs, and how it can be championed in ways that foster common ground, innovation, and long-term sustainability. So thank you so much for joining us today, Jonathan. Are you ready for your opening question?
I am. I do want to make a quick comment, though. As
Sure.
of last week, I actually moved into a new role. I probably should have told you all before this. And even funnier is that it's actually, I got promotion into my old role. So I am now the Associate Chief Academic Officer for the Idaho State Board of Education.
Congratulations.
Congrats.
Well, thank you. And coincidental to this conversation is, I imagine some listeners or some of you may have met my longtime colleague from the College of Western Idaho, Liza Long. She does a lot of work with the intersections of AI and OER, and she has moved into my previous role. So she's now our Academic Technology Program Manager for the state.
That's fantastic.
Well, awesome. Sorry we got your bio a little messed up, but congratulations on the new position.
Yeah, thanks.
So, Jonathan, can you start by sharing how your personal and professional path led you to become an advocate for open education?
At its simplest, I could say theft. I was I was an undergraduate student in the early 2000s, and I also realized within my first semester of my freshman year at college that professionally, I wanted nothing more than to be on a campus, be teaching classes, specifically teaching writing classes. And so I started befriending different faculty members that I was taking classes from. And because of my experience as a teenager working as a freelancer in graphic design and digital design, I knew a lot about where to find assets and resources and content online, make it available to my faculty, make it available to my friends, make it available to myself. Remix, functional remix, professional remix is really where I got to understand open licensing and open source. And that became a through line. I helped my faculty. They mentored me to get into the job market. And then by the time I was teaching my own classes, I had two things going for me. I was in writing studies. And so at the master's level, this is a discipline. It's one of the few that really focus on the craft of teaching and the pedagogy of teaching writing. And it's been that way for over 100 years. And so not only do I know how to teach, but I also had really strong ideas about what responsible teaching would look like. So for instance, in a lot of first-year writing classrooms, students really benefit from authentic student writing. And the best practice generally that I was hearing in classes or from my colleagues is, hey, if you want to use a really compelling compellingly good, compellingly bad piece of student writing, just ask them permission and they can write you a little note and say, you have permission to use this in future classes. And I said, that sounds legally questionable, but I do know about Creative Commons licenses. I know about how I can actually give students the agency to associate their work with a license and publish it for me and others to use in the future. And so I stumbled into open pedagogy, actually, that way, recognizing that I also was teaching online, so I wanted to use assets and materials. I didn't want to have questions about fair use or copyright. And also teaching writing in the 21st century, or really since the 90s, it's post what they call the visual turn. So much of writing in literacy is about digital expression and literacies. And so, I have students making podcasts, making posters, designing things. And so for me, it was not just a matter of how do I make my content come alive with things that they're actually caring about, but also how I do so ethically. So got involved in that. Fast forward to that sort of teaching and that sort of expertise, making me an advocate for professional development of my faculty colleagues, getting on the radar of online learning leaders. And within a few years, I was going after my PhD. I was administering online learning and instructional design and resource development at Clemson University. And my supervisor and mentor at the time, Whit Sally, was checking out what I was doing one day in preparation for a class. And he's like, so you know about open education? And I said, I have no idea what you're talking about with open education. I know about open universities. I know about concepts of openness. I know about open source, but what is open education? And that's it. It's a less, I think, straightforward path, but it's one that's based in being a practitioner, being a thoughtful educator, really caring about the co-construction of knowledge with my students. And so it's been great to also watch the field progressively move in that direction. But I think for reasons we'll also talk about today, is probably one of the reasons why, at least in Idaho and the work that I do in coordinating open education initiatives across the state, so much of our conversation is based in pedagogy.
I wonder if looking at how you frame this from student theft to responsible teaching, that's a unique framing for this, but, talking about at the system or the state level, and you've had all these different roles where you've been student, consumer, you've been advocate as instructor. How is the framing, or how does the approach change from implementing this at your course level and embracing the students to where you're now at a state level and you're trying to systemize this, I assume?
I'm so sorry, Kevin. You cut out.
Yeah, you cut out.
Oh,
you might have to repeat.
Well, my question is really about now that you've had this experience from student to instructor to now being at a state level, how does your approach change when you're trying to implement this and make it sustainable at a state level?
So my approach, and it's scaled pretty well as I've moved through administrative and leadership ranks, is to really start again with practice, to think about those who are most impacted from the policies and decisions of people in positions of leadership, people who are on the front lines. And that's where the majority of my time that I've been working as an academic administrator since 2013, I've also been teaching on the side, or I've been doing some form of faculty development. It's actually really helpful that I do that because I have a daughter who is turning 8 in November. And she knows I'm a teacher, but she doesn't understand that I'm a teacher. And so I've had to adopt the shorthand. It's like, well, Viv, I teach teachers how to teach for a living. So there is a place for that. And it makes a little bit more sense for her, I think. But being able to ground my understanding of what is possible into what is desirable, what is exciting, what the limitations are in terms of resources and bandwidth and obligations at the institution level is really pretty vital. And there's other ways to go about it besides, of course, just being in the classroom or being on a campus. One thing that I've seen a lot of, and we actually have benefited from this over the last 8 years in Idaho, is having an approach to communities of practice, like developing real authentic communities of practice where it might benefit from there being one individual who's there consistently and facilitating, but ultimately, if you really form a good affinity group that then funds a community of practice, you have a lot of shared stakes and ownership among all the participants, and you really have to remove the barriers of entry. I've removed the barriers of entry so much that our original guiding question still persists as our guiding question in our notes, which is, what's new? And the whole origin of this ongoing conversation that, like I said, is now spanned over 8 years, was running into librarians, instructional designers, online learning leaders, faculty, student leaders at different institutions in Idaho when I first started here, and also in some neighboring states. And them being excited, one, that I was at Boise State because they knew, or they had heard, or they had seen references on websites about work around open education, and no one knew who to contact. And even at Boise State, siloing is just always an inevitability. It's natural. People not really knowing where to start, and also none of us had open education in our job descriptions. It was just a passion project. So we started scheduling 30-minute or hour-long calls every week just to keep it front of mind, just to remind ourselves that even though we're in a rural state and we're distributed, that we had like minds, that we had energy, we had interest around these similar topics, and we could easily just answer the question of what's new and interpret it broadly. And so fast forward 8 years to where we are now, that conversation has matured so much around open education that we also found through various professional development and related conversations, and also just the natural evolution of that week-to-week conversation, that there is a pretty significant overlap between the faculty and practitioners and leaders who are interested in open, that are also interested in academic integrity, that are interested in accessibility, that are increasingly interested in generative AI. And it's a space that can accommodate all of it, because at the end of the day, it's still just about teaching and learning. It's really a grounding the importance of sustainable and effective teaching practices.
We've been talking a little bit over the last couple episodes around reframing. And, at the origins, it was really about cost savings and how it's evolved. How have you seen the messaging change in the last 8 years for how you've approached this?
So I call it an institutional limitation. Maybe it's the institutions I worked for that were the problem, in that my first teaching gig out of grad school was at a community college, and my students weren't clamoring for lower cost materials, especially because the nature of the courses I was teaching, either I was already using open resources or required very cheap, under $10 writing guide. And so for me, it was just, okay, well, how can I increase value? It wasn't a matter of cost savings, but value increase. How can I make this course more worthwhile? How can I make the assignments more enduring, less disposable? Then I went to Clemson, where I had originally got my master's, and I went back for my PhD, and I was working there. Clemson is the land grant for South Carolina, but there's a lot of enthusiasm among their leadership that often gets confused with a private school. And I was probably teaching and working alongside probably the wealthiest student population I've ever worked with. I would roll into the parking lot in my little 2001 S10 pickup and pull up alongside my students who were driving brand new BMWs. And so also there, cost wasn't really an issue, but it's also a school that is really focused on experiential education. And so there were a lot of opportunities too to work with departments to think about how we can co-construct knowledge, how we can get students opportunities before they graduate to publish scholarly content, how we can better rejuvenate the scope and reach of our undergraduate research programs, and so on. And then heading to Boise State, very, very different. Boise State was a junior college for 80 years, and then became probably the biggest commuter college I can think of, in that at least when I was starting there in 2017, the average age of the first year population was in their 20s. And so you had folks who maybe had taken a break between high school for various reasons, or were coming back to college for the first time. And we did some surveying on the ground to get a sense of what their interest was regarding costs and course materials. And even there, culturally, the idea was among these older students, on average, college costs money, and we're going to pay money for textbooks. They expected that this would be a cost associated with their education. What they didn't expect, that we heard time and time again, however, is they didn't expect to pay $200, $300, $400 for a textbook that they use once, or they read, a couple chapters from. And so that ended up being sort of a catalyst for having an interinstitutional conversation across the 4 colleges and 4 universities in our state around, is this common, or is this just a Boise State dynamic? Come to find out, not only was it common, but also we had plenty of faculty who were already trying to address this by assigning more library resources, so no new cost to students, using older versions of the textbooks. In some cases, faculty already knew about open educational resources or open textbooks. In most, if not all of these cases, however, unless you found a faculty member who was like tenured and getting close to retirement and really outspoken about what they were doing, culturally, the biggest resistance or point of reticence was faculty volunteering what it was that they were doing. Even though it was effective, even though students were benefiting from it, even though it was saving them money, they were holding back because the best way to ensure their academic freedom was to also not tell anyone what they were doing. And so for us, cost framing was never an incentive. It also wasn't really a burden. Instead, it was much more the culture of how can we use open education, open educational practices to make good on the promise of public education that this rural, poor state clearly cares about, and also up the value by talking about faculty agency and student agency in co-constructing knowledge and making materials, assignments, and so on more relevant and more localized to our context.
So, sorry. I'm interested. I think you've talked a little bit about like the differences between the different types of institutions and maybe even the different states and places that you've been and you've worked with different faculty and different stakeholders. Is there an approach you think that would work well across these different types of institutions, across different regions, where maybe the traditional methods might get maybe met with like some caution, or a way to maybe approach it where you can get buy-in that maybe from people who would be apprehensive about sharing what they're doing.
Yeah. My answer may not surprise you, but it's also, I think, more complicated than it's going to seem on its face. I have never taught a class or asked students to do something that I can't do myself, because I think that authentic scaffolding and being able to model both what successful practice and unsuccessful practice looks like for others is part of the learning process. It's how learning is a social becoming. And that standard of how I collaborate with others, because I consider my students collaborators, it's another thing that has scaled with me from leaving the classroom and going into administrative work, and especially going into policy level work, which is largely what I've done since 2019. And going back to 2019, when I first came to work for the State Board of Education, some helpful clarification there is that they write and pass policy without having to go to the legislature. And so effectively, their policies have the force and effect of law in governing public education K through 20 in the state of Idaho. We're one of 2 states that has that model. And I came in and we had a number of policies that hadn't been touched in a long, long time. One of them, and this is one that was on my radar that I really wanted to bolster or fortify, was our academic freedom policy, which had been written, I think, in the 70s and hadn't been touched since. It was half a page long, and it was just a copy and paste from the AAUP standard of whenever that was published. And so that seemed like an opportunity to do two things. One, go out and engage with the academic community, both experts in academic freedom and also faculty who, the term that I've always heard is like difficult faculty, but I find it endearing because I consider myself a difficult faculty member. I don't like being told no unless you have a good reason. I also don't like being told I can't do something when I know I can do it.
Agreed.
And I think that the best faculty partners that we can hope to work with are those who are difficult, because it means they care. It's much, much harder to work with a faculty member who doesn't have a perspective or is apathetic. So this was an opportunity for me to go talk to people who might have misperceptions, perceptions, expertise around academic freedom. Two, I also recognize that having a true and instructive definition of what academic freedom looks like benefits everybody, because then we're not just waving around vague notions of what is or is not academic freedom. And three, it's integral to the sort of work that I cared about, which again is around effective teaching practices, effective learning practices, the proliferation of educational resources and materials, the co-construction of knowledge. And so one of the first policies I ended up really overhauling and working on at the state level was our academic freedom policy that ballooned from a half-page policy to a 8-page policy that systematically talks about the interplay between the academic freedom of students, the academic freedom of faculty, the academic freedom of institutions, and the responsibilities that are all bound to those different points of connection. And I didn't have to do that. I could have gone and just studied in a vacuum other existing policies from other states and hybridize them, remix them into something else uniquely, and just said, well, this is it. This is the new standard, and it's appropriate because we have all these other like forms. Instead, I got my hands dirty. I showed up and I put myself out there as someone who had functional expertise, but I'm by no means an expert in academic freedom. I was able to model the sort of learning, the sort of curiosity, the sort of openness that I wanted to see from our community as we were adapting this new policy. I've also done the same thing at that same time. We had one $50,000 grant of found funding supporting very specific investigation of OER around our general education courses. $50,000 doesn't go very far, very quickly, especially when it's a full state. And so I had to rapid prototype a professional development fellowship where we got faculty from multiple institutions to work on exploring and understanding open publishing in general. And the only incentive we could provide them is we'll offset the cost of you attending some event that is dedicated to open education. And that whole process, I was there working with them as both a project manager and a collaborator on all of these projects. And they had to see where I stumbled, where I knew what I was talking about, where I was also learning in tandem with them. And I think it's so critical, whether you're in the classroom or you're at the state level, you're at an institution, if you want someone to do something, you have to make it abundantly known that you also have stakes in this, that you're also willing to feel the pain, that you're going to be there in the trenches with them. And I'm not saying that it's the most sustainable practice, and there's definitely been times where I've had to pull back, but that's also where my expectations, rightfully or responsibly, also need to pull back on what I expect progress to look like. Because the imperative for me when I was coming from Boise State to come work for the state board office was recognizing that there was a significant disconnect between the policies that were being passed and how they were being implemented, because we had leadership of the state that said, well, we passed a policy, here you go. And then they were dismayed that it wasn't getting implemented in the way that they wanted to. That's because no one was doing the work to make sure that the stakeholders at the institution level understood it, and also even in the policy drafting process, that you understood the real authentic context of what was happening at the institutions. So it's a self-feeding arrangement that really needs to exist, where everybody recognizes and reminds each other what the stakes are, the common stakes are in these efforts.
I guess somewhat related to that note, and obviously, the particularities of the State Board of Education in Idaho are, like you mentioned, different than in other states. But we're really seeing, across the country, educational leaders face really different policy environments. And, how have you seen, OER advocates successfully navigate some of those political/policy differences?
I'm glad you asked that question. It's one that I get asked often from my colleagues and counterparts in what they would consider quote unquote blue states, and Idaho being a quote unquote red state. They wonder how we're able to maintain some of the programs that we have around innovative teaching and learning practices, around open, around online. And I think it comes down to two just stark realities. One is we're a small state with only 8 institutions. If you're doing any work in teaching and learning that's related to in any degree to what someone else is doing at another institution, you're going to find them. You're going to meet each other. You're going to become quick collaborators because more often than not, we are wearing many hats and we're single points of failure on like programs. So, the resolve is there. We're mission-driven folks, and we understand what we're doing. But we also understand what we don't have, which is we never have time. We never have money. We never have resources, nor have we come to expect it. And so the answer that I tend to give my colleagues when they're reaching out to me from blue states, especially in the recent landscape where maybe they've lost some federal funding or some state funding to support their initiatives is, they ask me, well, what are you doing? How are you weathering all this? And I'm like, well, we built our programs or we built our initiatives with the understanding, it's not the belief, but like the firm understanding that none of it's going to get subsidized. That shouldn't stop us from doing the right thing, though, or doing something that we care about. What it means, however, is we need to think creatively and collaboratively about how we align the work that we want to do with the work that we're already expected to do or the work that we are doing. And I think that is also organically where a lot of the conversations are situating open education as open educational practices that have pedagogical relationships across disciplines. It really came from, okay, none of us have open education in our job description, none of us have OER in our job description, but I am involved in quality assurance, or I'm involved in faculty development, or I'm a librarian. And in the case of library faculty, they have a service obligation. It's like, how can I carve out time in my service obligation to also focus on these initiatives? Or in my case, as a policymaker, I'm already working with materials that are supposed to be available, open access to the public. Or reside in the public domain. Just because they exist in public domain, though, doesn't mean that they're going to be engaged with. And so then what sort of wraparounds, what sort of additional publications and collaborations can I do to forward the relevance and the utility of these policies? Because what I find to be a personal point of defeat is when we have good policies that exist and no one's reading them, because often they're at least under my watch, they're written with the intent to be read and to be used, especially by faculty if they're running into any sort of pushback on the practices that they're trying to pursue that are innovative or generative. And so the long and short, though, is like what that looks like in Idaho is we've had hearings in front of the legislature. We have board members who they're all appointed by governors. And they're appointed to serve terms that could outlast any governor or gubernatorial term. One of our board members is a politician. It's our state superintendent. And there are always political headwinds that we are navigating. And in this specific case of open education, because we've been able to come to them where they're asking us to come and ask for money, or they're wanting us to report on what we're doing, the fact that there's no new dollar sign attached to it, that we're just going to keep doing this work because we've ingrained it within the culture of effective teaching and learning practices across our state, it makes a world of difference because we're not subject then to, especially when it comes to the legislature, the power of their purse strings that they can either give or take. It's far less disruptive because effectively we're just still doing what we would always already be doing. The difference is we've now built enough of a culture and we've gotten enough recognition that we have opportunities around what qualifies, like I said earlier, as service work, what qualifies for tenure and promotion. We have opportunities that are easy to justify around folks getting fellowships or publishing new articles or books. Because effectively, we're just co-opting the academic lifestyle or the scholarly pursuits of those who work in the education community as something that is just core to being an open education professional or practitioner.
Yeah, I gotta say, I really love that answer. It's not a red state or blue state thing or a purple state thing. It's a practice. It's collaboration. And it's moving it forward without the expectation of any sort of monetary incentives or anything like that. Because I don't know about Brittany, and I do think I know with Kevin is that I started doing this just because I was passionate about it. There were no grants or anything like that. I was just like, this is a cool thing to do, and I think it'll help our campus, and just did it and found collaborators. So yeah, no, I think that's really, really wise advice.
I mean, I was doing it to save students money. And then I also was doing it because I really do like paying people to do this. So when I was doing it on the state level, the idea of, getting grants and writing grants and getting grant money, from our legislature and being able to pay faculty and instructors and learning designers and, that to me, to pay people to do things that they never thought they'd get paid to do, that does bring me joy.
But to that end, Brittany, something that I was really wary of when, like I said, this random $50,000 fell in my lap right after starting at the board office, and they were getting ready to give it back because no one had done anything with it since the previous legislative session, and we were about to go into another session a month later. Having come from Boise State and where I was also working directly in professional faculty development support, I had seen so much money not get lit on fire, but maybe not used to its best extent with one-time stipends or grants to faculty. And it also just so happened that my dissertation was on faculty development, faculty learning around open education in general. And something that I was hearing from a lot of the faculty I was interviewing with is that they knew the game of the CTLs at their institutions. And if I sign up and I show up and I tick off these boxes and I get some funding, and that's great because it pads out and supplements my salary. And I'm not going to read that as negative practice because effectively I've only ever taught as a contingent faculty member. It's a hustle. You're a contractor. And so that's all well and good. But to your point, what I loved was two things were true with the faculty fellowship program I created off of that $50,000. One is that for the first time, the board was creating professional development opportunities for community college faculty because the relationship of our board with our community colleges is that shared governance. They have local boards. We have our state board, but it means that some of our policies also don't apply to them. At the same time, as an open education professional, I knew that the community colleges punch above their weight in terms of the impact they can have by getting involved with open education program. And so this $50,000 and putting the sole intent on it that this is supposed to be effectively professional development money for you to go to a conference, and if you have any left over, you can devote it to buying a new device so that it can help you with your open publishing and the projects that you're working on. Some of these community college faculty had never gone to a professional conference before,
Right.
or they had the worst issued laptop of their department, right? And so this was an opportunity to provide some investment, some equitable investment in faculty who were teaching the same classes. They were just at different institutions, and some of those institutions were poorer and some of them were richer. And so being able to level that playing field, it also really helped bolster the collaboration while, to your point, Brittany, being able to give folks some opportunities they hadn't had before.
Exactly. It's the same to me, right? To be able to give instructors opportunities, and staff too, right? Staff opportunities that they haven't had, just like we give students opportunities that they haven't had. Two sides of the same coin, I guess.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about, I know that, Brittany, you're part of the Doers organization, and Zach and I have also had stints there. And I know that one of the conversations we had a couple of years ago was about promoting OER recognition within the tenure and promotion process. And the fact that Idaho has policy or is accepting it is mind-blowing. It's so wonderful. And just reflecting on this whole process of how you've been using policy effectively to support and promote open, where I think historically folks have been really worried about trying to set policy because it would be too restrictive or it would be twisted or turned. And I understand you're at the state level, but had you gotten feedback from constituent units like, hey, don't do that, just leave it quiet, leave it alone?
Yeah. So some helpful context here. I was talking about the academic freedom policy as board policy 3B, as in boy. That was one policy that I had on my radar that I really wanted to influence when I came to the board office, but it was also because of another policy that had recently been passed, sort of in these shady circumstances, in that, like, it was fairly secretive. This board policy called 3U, that going back to 2019, 2018, and the conversation that you're kind of describing, Kevin, with the policy landscape, you might remember there was some policy development happening in Hawaii that became very contentious, and they ended up pulling it back because it was expecting that OER specifically would be adopted in very specific classes to some arbitrary degree, because it's a good idea, so let's just impose it. And I can't think of a quicker way to kill authentic grassroots enthusiasm about anything than to impose arbitrary standards and a timeline on it. And so, Hawaii, that came and went. In Idaho, however, one of the reasons why I had been introduced to the state board is because of the community practice I was talking about. We had started developing and rapid prototyping a number of different resources to help each other, especially around general education, because all of our gen ed courses are common indexed. And so if I'm taking English 101 at the College of Eastern Idaho, it counts in terms of transferring credit. And often the curriculum is also very comparable, if not the same, with Boise State. And so it was a great opportunity for us to look at, okay, what resources are pre-existing, already out there, if we're just working with faculty and trying to get them to take a look at an open textbook or look at an OER. And meanwhile, the academic officer at the time learned about what we were doing, had us do some different workshops. I attended a board meeting where we were also talking about some of the work that we were doing. Our board members were getting very interested in open education. But again, I told you there was a disconnect between the board office and the board and the institutions. And it's that on their committee schedule, I'd get an invite, or some of my other OER colleagues would get an invite in the state, and we would kind of give them some feedback. And then I don't remember what the context was, but the academic officer late one night decided to just draft an OER policy and got it passed. And it got passed right before I started my first job for the state board. And thankfully, my position then was a brand new position, and it was all external facing to the institutions. It was focused on policy implementation. And immediately I had colleagues and counterparts from the institution. It's like, can you believe this policy? Can you believe this 3U policy? Did he not listen to us at all? We've been warning, don't pass a policy like this. And now here it is, and it's on the books. And I said, well, don't worry. My whole job now is implementing policy, and I'm not going to implement this one. And what we're going to do instead is actually the exact same process I talked about earlier with that academic freedom policy. Is we're going to go to the practitioners. We're going to give voice to the people who are most vulnerable and have most to lose by a policy like this. And we are going to interrogate what is happening. Like, this is actually a great cause. So there's the silver lining here is now everyone's bristling, especially the practitioners, especially the faculty who have been trying to do all sorts of creative things to lower the cost and increase access for their students. And that's what we found. We found that, like, what Idaho needs is not an OER policy. What we need is a policy that recognizes that from the position of course materials, that is one thing that faculty can change that make a considerable difference to the access and affordability that students have to their required materials, to knowledge, and so on. And access and affordability are goals, standards, values of our board. And so then what emerged was a broader policy on course material access and affordability. It's the namesake under board policy 3U. And it references OER. It references a scale of cost framing for course marking. It talks about we don't use the phraseology of publishers, but we talk about automatic billing programs instead of inclusive access programs. Again, it's a policy that's meant to instruct, but it's also one that is, in terms of implementation, it expects or it sets a standard for every institution to have a plan on recognizing how any choices that faculty make that increase access and affordability of course materials for students is effective teaching and learning practice. It is the scholarship of teaching and learning, and it deserves to be rewarded and recognized. And so every one of our 8 institutions, they have now plans that they curate and they maintain every year that has also led them to adopt professional development programs, infrastructure, publishing initiatives, create their own grants. These are all things that we were just sort of piecemealing together. And now it's actually been fortified by policy at the state level, where they also have their own local policies, recognizing that this is the sort of teaching and learning practices that we want to see, and we want to see them develop. And we want people to have the sort of security knowing that, no, we're not going to say that X number of sections in Math 108 need to use OER at any given campus. We're going to say that OER is a means to an end, not an end in itself, to borrow from like a really common phrase in our movement, right? And in fact, library resources are also great. Public domain is also great. Co-constructing new knowledge with students is also great. And that there are many, many ways to make an Idaho education meaningful, valuable, relevant, and enduring for these students. And that's where it's easy, I think, for folks to not only feel recognized, but feel more confident in, like I said, there's this non-zero percentage of OER faculty or OER leaders who have now moved on to be also AI leaders and digital learning leaders and online learning leaders and accessibility specialists. And I mean, some of these folks also have more certifications in this stuff than I do now, which is great because I don't have to be certified in all the things to help create positive change.
You mentioned AI, and I think we're going to try to slip that one question in while we still have time.
Are we going to? All right.
We're going to go for it, Zach.
All right. So, I saw that you've been doing some work on the confluence of AI and open education. And I'm really interested in hearing, how do you see these two things working together or not as the open movement advances?
I'm conflicted, to be honest with you, Zach. I shouldn't be surprised though too, because I was conflicted when I learned that there was a formal open education movement, because I'm like, for reasons that I started with around theft and remix and banditry of IP, I never operated under the assumption that I needed permission to do anything creative and cool. And I'm also an artist by my background, so that's part of it. An artist, and I grew up singing and playing in punk bands. But beyond that, I have trained scholarly instincts as it looks to assessing technological innovation, though I hate using the term innovation because really it's just like, what is the spectrum of technology adoption and progress that we've seen? And when you're a writing teacher, you also trace it all the way back to written forms of language and spoken forms of language and the technical aspects of those as well. So, generative AI as we know it now, it's a little bit more sophisticated. It's running from a literacy standpoint, it's running differently, it's creating differently in terms of scope than what I've seen in my classroom. But also, I've had Grammarly in my class, and I've had other tools that have machine learning throughout my time being a writing instructor. And so then it starts coming down to, well, how is this going to influence my practice? And the responsible educator says, well, if this now undermines my assessment standards and the way I was trying to conduct my assignment, it's time to build a better assignment. It's time to reassess how I assess. The overworked and underappreciated faculty member would say that, like, oh, this is nuclear. This is a nightmare. What are we going to do? And I'm somewhere in the middle because I'm not teaching right now, but I'm working with a lot of faculty who are, and a lot of faculty who are excited about the implications while also recognizing that there's some ethical considerations around environmental impact, around right now in Idaho, this is one of the good reasons to have this conversation. We're worried about what we're seeing emerging with mental health and the intersection of AI and mental health. When you have a sycophancy machine, what that does to a person psychologically is not great. But what we can't do, I think, is just, one, because it's not a very scholarly approach, is just say that this new technology is largely untested. It has a high fail rate. There's lots of garbage and junk out there, but we can't vilify it because what we all know is you vilify something, people are still going to use it, if not find it even more attractive to use. And so our questions are, okay, let's be generative about generative AI, and let's figure out where is it actually improving our workflows, recognizing that, of course, if we're grounding it in labor conversations, that we are overworked and underpaid. So how can that increase new efficiencies in, say, open publishing and the writing and construction of materials? But also, how can we build a community that recognizes where we don't want people to stumble through this new technology like we are to find its inefficiencies. Let's test it. Let's kick the tires. Let's try and break it. And let's be open in celebrating where it works well and where it doesn't. And that then, again, is that feedback mechanism where it's like we have on the ground laboratories in our classrooms at our institutions that are then bringing back up to us perspective and guidance. We haven't written a policy yet, but we also haven't had to, because I think the general understanding right now we have a faculty group of 8, what we're calling catalysts. They're faculty members from each institution who are working and meeting regularly with one statewide AI leader who's also co-located at one of our institutions, and with our staff to just inform us on how things are maturing quickly, what student responses and experiences, what they're navigating with, what tools they're running into that they think are useful, and also just generally giving us a descriptive understanding of the hype cycle, because I think that's what we're also seeing. Just like any other piece of educational technology or otherwise technology, we're rounding a hype cycle that's incredibly predictable, even though, this time last year, generative AI seemed like the most disruptive thing facing education as we know it. And you talk to publishers, they still think the same thing about open education. The difference is OER had its hype cycle, but now what we're seeing is all of the other implications, I think philosophically, in terms of our values and why we do what we do, that are proving that the innovation of open education or open educational practices themselves, it's not that they are novel, it's not that they're an innovation, it's that they're making good on the promises and the mission that we all already subscribe to when we decide to be educators.
Imagine if we could actually say, instead of, hey, there's AI inside, which is the hook now, hey, this is openly licensed, and it had the same kind of resonance.
Right.
Well, Jonathan, I want to be cognizant of everyone's time and understanding that we all have other things going on that we need to get to. But I really want to thank you for the conversation today. This has been really fascinating. It's been a great insight into, the development of your OER journey, but also seeing how that really plays out in Idaho and the lessons I think that we can all take from that experience and apply in our own local circumstances.
Well, thanks for that. I remember probably a quarter of what we talked about, but I hope it was useful to somebody out there. That's the that's the goal with open education
Good thing we
always.
can
It's like we're going
listen
to
to
put
it.
stuff out there, right? And hopefully
Right.
it helps somebody.
So the way that we have established wrapping up these little chats is by sending out a little AI-generated open ed joke. So here's the one that we have to offer for this week. It's, why don't OERs ever get lonely? Because they're always open for adoption.
Wah, wah.
So terrible. So terrible.
Oh, no.
And everyone,
you.
with that, the mic's closed. Thanks so much for joining us today.